Morning.
Morning.
Everybody doing all right? Yeah? Okay. I'll tell you, I'm excited to be here, excited to be hanging out with you guys today. It's going to be a marathon day. I got 5 talks today. I start right now and I finish at 8:30 tonight. So we're going to see what kind of endurance I have by the end of this day. I'll tell you, there's a lot of folks that go into putting something like this together. My primary contact I've been talking with has been Shelly. Shelly's been making sure to track me down, make sure I'm where I'm supposed to be, and everything's turned in the way it's supposed to be. And these events take a lot to put together, and I think without obviously you got a lot of collaboration that's happened to make this happen, to make this possible for you guys. So if you guys don't care for just a minute to give a hand to the folks that have made this opportunity. All right, so what I'm going to do is I've got 55 minutes to talk, and I've got probably about an hour and 20 minutes, or about an hour or so of content. So I'm going to try to speak slowly. I was in Illinois a couple weeks ago and Iowa last week, and two cities in a row I was told I talk too fast. And my problem is I get excited and I have to slow myself down sometimes, so I'm going to try to not talk so fast that I lose you. And I also understand that I have a slight accent, in case you can't notice, and sometimes that can cause a challenge as well. So I'm going to try to speak as clearly as I can, but I can't help it because I get pretty excited about this stuff. You guys have sat through a lot of PD, you've sat through a lot of trainings, some better than others. I like to tell folks what you can expect from me when I speak. First thing is, I'm not going to read PowerPoint slides to you. Is that okay with you? Yeah? Have you been to that one? Yeah, where someone steals your life one slide at a time and you can just feel it go. I was in a training in Columbus, Ohio. I'm from the most southern tip of Ohio, a little town called Chesapeake, right across the river from Huntington, West Virginia. If you ever seen the We Are Marshall movie, I live about 5 miles away from Marshall, and actually my other job is the associate director of the Autism Training Center at Marshall. So I was in a training in Columbus, Ohio, and it was on clinical supervision, and it was a 6-hour training, and this cat had blue slides with yellow writing. Yes, I have no physiological research to back this up, but that makes you have to pee all day. It's something about that color combination. And for 6 hours, this guy would start with a big blue slide, he'd push his button, and the sentence would come in, and he'd read it word for word. And it was horrible. So I'm not going to do that to you. Another thing is, when you run into folks that do things like keynote speeches and things like that, it can get hokey kind of quick if you're not careful. How many people we have that teach you in the elementary grades? Okay, I did a lot of work in early childhood and in elementary. Still do a lot of different work in that now, but I used to go to a lot of those conferences, and I learned that when I walked into a breakout session and a person had a musical instrument on, I would leave. Because I was certain that at some point that person was going to ask me to jump and dance or shake or wiggle, and I prefer not to do that in the middle of the morning. I probably do my best work in that kind of circumstance late at night with limited light is where I do my best dancing. That's my ideal circumstances for my rhythmic expression. So no worries about that. I'm not going to break out a musical instrument and tell you to jump and wiggle or shake your thing, and I'm not shaking mine. If you decide that's something you want to do, that's going to be completely up to you. And that'll be between you and YouTube and Facebook or whoever gets their camera out fast enough. So last but certainly not least is the fact that I'm going to talk about some emotionally intense content, but I'm not going to make it uncomfortable or awkward for you in the way that I'm not going to ask you to do anything that would compromise your comfort. In some trainings, especially when we start talking about things like trauma, about things like attachment, about things like later on I'm talking about happiness, you would anticipate that there's something I might make you do that's uncomfortable. I came to this conclusion that I'm not that kind of speaker because it was done to me. I was at a conference and I was there on Thursday, and I was actually the main speaker on Friday, so I went to hear the main speaker on Thursday. A friend of mine from back home went with me. Sometimes folks from back home will travel with me. And we're sitting in about close to the front row, and the keynote speaker goes to the edge of the stage and says, "I want everybody to stop and turn to the person beside you and take their hand and tell them why you love children." My buddy looks at me and goes, "Dude, I'm not touching you." I said, "I'm not touching you either." So at no point in our conversation will you be asked to touch, hug, or rub your neighbor or tell them some deep secret about why you love children. If you do decide that's something you would like to do, I just prefer that you get a thumbs up first. Before you go in the bubble, I've worked in corrections long enough to know that that's how felonies start. So be careful. It's just good advice. I have just one way of speaking. Sometimes I've learned that some speakers have like a stage or speaker self, and then they have their personality. I'm just the same cat all day. I think keeping up with multiple personalities would be exhausting. I've had people tell me though that if my speaking career was going to continue to advance, that I would have to make some changes. One lady in Pennsylvania, in fact, gave me some very specific advice. She came up to me after I got done doing a talk on mental health issues and behavioral challenges in young children. And it's not uncommon for people to come up and ask like a personal question or a student in their class or whatever it might be. So she was kind of floating around the back, and I kind of tell that's probably what she was going to do. And everybody kind of asked some questions, and then she comes up and she goes, Dr. Harris, I really enjoyed your talk. And I said, oh, well, thanks. And she says, but when you first started to speak, I was concerned. I said, okay. And she said, your accent's quite dominating. And I said, well, thank you. I don't know if it was a compliment, but I took it as one. And she said, no, seriously, you seem to know what you're talking about. But do you know they have classes to fix how you talk? I said, ma'am, I'm standing right here. Like, that's something you say in the back and leave early, right? You don't go up to me and say, look at you big country person. You keep it up and someday you're going to be something. So this is it. My wife works on my English as much as she can, but my accent, I think you should be proud of where you're from. I think you should be proud of who you are, and the way that I talk is part of that, and I'm proud of that. So I'm not changing that anytime soon. Well, a big thing is I'm not an expert on. Sometimes you have folks come in from out of town, you assume they're an expert. I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert, because I think people that tell you they're an expert make me nervous. Because what they're telling you is that they're at the peak of a knowledge base. And I've worked with children and families long enough to know that just the moment I think I have kids and families figured out, man, do I get humbled, right? And and that's the challenge with it, is in my opinion, no matter how long you've been working in this field, you have to maintain a student's mindset, or else what happens is, you have the needs of the children and families that you serve, and then you have your skill set. Your challenge is you're constantly trying to close that gap to make your skill set as close to the needs of the children and families that you serve. So that way your abilities are relevant to their needs. So what happens is if someone believes they're an expert and then stalls or stops their growth or development or professional development, then the needs, because it's inevitable, society's constantly changing. The needs of the families and children that they serve continue to advance, but they're not advancing in their professional development. So what happens is this huge gap starts to happen. This is the gap where burnout happens. This is a gap where frustration occurs. And then what happens is they need something to account for this frustration. So what can happen is you can start to get actually angry and frustrated at the people that you're supposed to be helping, because they're not what you think they should be, or society's not where you think it should be. And I'm not telling you have to accept all the ills of society, but we have to learn about them. We have to understand them. We have to think about it. And I think that's why this talk this morning is important, because I know you have children in your community that are being exposed to trauma and chronic stress. And they learn differently. So if your job is to help and serve families, whether it be as an educator or a service or helping professional in another realm, your job then is to figure out, how do I build my skills to account for these differences that people that I serve today are. So that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. The good thing is you get to relax and enjoy yourself. We walk out of here. My challenge is that you will walk out better than you walked in. That's not like a grandiose or egotistical thing to say, I think. I think that's my responsibility. If I came here, if everybody had planned to bring me here brought me here, and if I left my wife and my boys back home in Ohio to get here, then I better add some value while I'm here, or else there's no point in me being here. I think anybody that speaks today, anybody that provides any service, needs to have that level of responsibility, that what they provide, that when folks walk out, they walk out better than they walked in. So, first thing we got to start with is, what's your theory about things like trauma? What's your theory about things like chronic stress and what that looks like? Now, the biggest challenge for me, one of the challenges for me in understanding trauma and things like that is, I'm not a speaker that can tell you I don't have a troubling past as a child or whatever it might be. I mean, in regard to some of the serious stories that you'll hear sometimes. I grew up in a fairly middle-class family in a small town in southern Ohio. So when I first started getting exposed to the experiences that kids could have, it was really a challenge for me to stretch my psychology to consider how those things could happen, to consider how parents could give up their children, to consider how a parent could hurt or harm their child, to consider how a parent could use a substance to the level that it would risk the safety of their child. It was really hard for me to understand those things. And not that I completely accept them, but I need to understand them professionally in order to be effective in my work. So for some folks, your first step in understanding how to better help kids that have been traumatized is to take a step back and say, gosh, I have to realize that not everybody was raised like me. I have to recognize that there are kids that have profoundly different experiences. So that might mean that the things that worked with me may not work with them because they're coming from a different base, a different place in their life experiences and how that works. So my first, I would say, sobering moment in working with trauma was, and of course, when I tell clinical examples, I have to switch things around a little bit, of course, for confidentiality. But I can remember I was 21 years old when I got my first job, like my first after my degree job. And so I remember I was a home-based parent educator. Now, let me rewind that for you just a second. I was 21 years old, and I was a home-based parent educator on parental removal cases. And here's the thing. I'll be completely honest with you. I knew I was incompetent. Does anybody remember that in your career? You remember starting going, holy crap, they're really going to give me this job. You remember that? I remember, like, I sat through all the classes, I took all the exams, I did all that stuff, but there's a big difference between doing something like that and setting foot in someone's home that just had their kids removed and saying, now let's create a plan to help your kids better. So I knew, I knew that I had a lot to learn and a lot of growth to make early in my career. One of the things I did have that motivated me to get that work was I had student loans. And anybody knows that student loans, you need that job. So that's where you start. But I was brought in on a case where I went into the foster home to see this little girl. And at this time, this little girl was 3 years old. And she had been removed from her parents' home. And I walked in and I said, oh, and the foster mom greeted me and everything. And she goes, she's just over there playing. You can go over there and see her. And I remember going over and getting down on her level, kind of squatting down, and she's over there playing. And she didn't really notice me at first. And then she turns and looks at me. Now, this isn't going to be kind of a non-scientific example, but anybody that's had this experience with somebody will be able to relate to what I mean. And when she looked at me, she looked right through me. And I didn't feel a connection. I didn't feel a curiosity. I didn't feel anything. Now, has anybody ever had that experience where, whether it be an adult or a child or someone who's had, either they have a severe mental illness or they've had severe trauma that can later, of course, relate to mental illness. When that little girl looked at me, she looked right through me. And I can remember I tried to do different things, like tried to do all the stuff you do with a 3-year-old to try to get him to be cute or play, but I could not get her to connect with me at all. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And the foster mom even said to me, you know what's weird is even when she gets in my lap sometimes, I don't feel like we ever get close. She doesn't ever feel close to me. She just kind of is with me. Well, later this young lady was diagnosed with a disorder called reactive attachment disorder, which is probably the most difficult thing I've tried to treat in childhood, is reactive attachment disorder, which is about that trauma that happens. It can happen, kids have extreme trauma neglect in their first 3 years of life, which then affects their brain's ability to connect and relate with other people. It's a real challenge. It can be lifelong challenges for folks. Well, the reason this little girl had developed this is the trauma that she had was when she was first removed was their neighbors where she lived would complain that they would hear a baby cry. Kept hearing a baby cry, kept hearing a baby cry. And this was when she was a little bit under 2 years old. And they would hear her cry and hear her cry. And eventually they called the police. This part of the where she lived, they didn't have a lot of trust in law enforcement because of a lot of cultural issues. But so eventually they said, you know, we're going to call the police after having this experience for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the police go and they bust down the door and they find a little girl in a walker in the middle of the kitchen, and the walker's taped to the floor. And what would happen is the mom would go out late at night and would tape the walker to the floor and leave her under 2-year-old daughter in that walker, and she would cry and cry and cry and cry and cry until she would eventually just fall asleep. So what happened was her brain changed because of this experience. And I can remember thinking in my head, I that puzzled me so much that her reaction, her behavior didn't match the way I thought it should be. And then when I started looking into this idea of trauma, then I started recognizing, when I was in college, I worked in juvenile detention facilities, that these kids that I worked with in some of these juvenile detention facilities had variations of those kind of experiences, and they had also some symptoms as they got older that they were hard to connect with, and they could be extremely manipulative and not as emotional as what you'd anticipate. So I started digging into this concept of trauma. Now, the first thing you got to understand about trauma is there's two big things about the brain. There's all kinds of stuff people like to talk about the brain. Two most important things you need to know about the brain. One is the brain is a pattern-seeking device. What does that mean? Pattern-seeking device means your whole brain's job is to identify and code patterns in your head. That's its whole job. Everything from, let me give you an example. How many people have kids? You may have kids, right? Okay, toddler. Toddler's got a sippy cup sitting on the high chair. What are they going to do? They take the sippy cup and they drop it off the high chair. And then they watch you like, now what, right? So you get up, you walk over, you pick up the sippy cup, you put it back on the high chair, okay? Let's say during dinner time. Then the toddler will sit there and wait, maybe take a couple drinks, right? Wait for you to go back, sit down, and get a bite of food in your mouth. That's about then, right? Then it takes a sippy cup and drops it off the high chair and looks at you like, now what? And what do? You come over, usually pick it up, put it back on the thing. What is that? That's pattern recognition. That is an experiment. What am I doing? I'm testing cause and effect. I'm trying to identify a pattern. That's all. And then what happens is they take all these patterns and build that up. That's from that toddler who's doing that, dropping the sippy cup, all the way to people at MIT studying things like quantum physics. What are we always trying to do? We're trying to identify patterns in our world. Why? Because patterns help us predict the future and make us feel safe. They make us feel like we're in a safe place. When you guys are teaching, no matter what you're teaching patterns. We study history because history is about patterns. Math is patterns. Everything is your brain trying to make sense of the world in order to be as effective and safe as possible. The second part of it is the brain, learning and growth takes place in the context of relationships. Now, this is something I won't back off of at all when it comes to helping people, is relationships as beginning and end. That's the beginning and the end. That's the context in which growth and development takes place. Take a look at this. Why does that little baby want to walk? What's motivating that baby to walk? The relationship with his mom, right? You guys remember this with your own kids? You remember your kids cruising on the couch? You know, the kids cruising. You think you want them to walk, right? You're like, I think you should walk. Until they start walking, then you think they should hold still, right? When they're on that couch, what do you do to get them off the couch? How do you motivate them to come off the couch? What's your gesture? Okay, we do that. We do upside down spirit sprinkles, right? This is what we do, right? This. We do, and what we hope, and then what we do, the whole exchange of that is, the baby's here, and the baby looks at you and is motivated by the relationship. And this is what the interesting about it is. The couch is safe. The couch is a place that they're certain will continue to be safe. But only the relationship can say to them, it's worth the risk. Because development is oftentimes is a risk. It's an expansion. It's a next step. So the kid says it's worth the risk. That relationship makes it worth the risk. So you could say, people say, well, humans are built to walk. Well, yes, physically, a baby's hips are a certain way, the head gets to a certain size, and then they're capable of walking. But a child only walks when they're motivated to walk, which is the relationship that motivates. Same way language develops, same way as a lot of the skills that we have develop, is not because we're capable of it, but because we're motivated by it in the relationships that we have. So big thing you got to think about is trauma affects patterns in our brains and the relationships that we have. So the two primary ways that the brain works, trauma affects those two things significantly. One of the ways you can tell about how powerful something like relationships is remove it from someone's life. You want to see how powerful a relationship is? Remove it from a human being's life. It's right there with the food and water type need. If you remove love and affection from a baby, they can actually die from non-organic failure to thrive. They can be fed and have their diapers changed. Unfortunately, we know too much about this with orphanages all over the world, that they can be fed and have their diapers changed and still die. Because the need for that human connection and what that human connection does to the physiology. We know about people in incarceration when they put in segregation and how they could have zero mental health history before. Well, no history of psychotic symptoms. You put them in a room by themselves long enough, and they can develop delusions and hallucinations. We look at long-term care facilities, the same thing can happen. One of the interesting things about research in long-term care facilities, because we have a large aging population right now, one of the things that they've shown is even people that are quote-unquote non-responsive or non-verbal, if they just wheel these people into the social area, they can show an improvement in their vital signs. So what does that tell you? Human beings heal each other. We heal each other. Our connections heal each other. So this idea of what is trauma? Now I'm going to give you my definition. There's probably 15,000 definitions by all these different associations where a room full of people in fancy clothes argued over and/or and a hyphen or a colon and those kinds of things. What I'm going to give you is how my clinical experience has taught me what trauma is. Trauma is this. You have an expectation for your life, okay? You have an expectation for the patterns in your life. Trauma is an experience or an event that significantly interrupts or changes that pattern. Let me give you a quick example. I had a family I was working with. They had a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. Okay? On a Monday night, their mother and father went out to dinner and were in a car accident and died that night. Mom and dad both died in the same night. Okay? Now this 4-year-old and 7-year-old live with their grandparents. So these little people, these 4-year-old and 7-year-old, they had patterns in their head of what they expected their life to be like. Because you know what? They got up every morning, mom and dad was there. Even when before they could even remember consciously. Every morning I wake up, my mom and dad are here. Every morning I wake up, my mom and dad take care of me. Every morning, every time when I come home from school at some form in the day, my mom and dad are here. So I expect my parents to be here. And here's another thing they noticed. Hey, you know what too? Older kids, their mom and dad are still here. That's kind of neat. And people that are adults, their mom and dads are for the most part are still here. So guess what I'm going to expect in my life is that my parents are going to be here for a really long time. But that night, they lost both of their parents. So they had this expected reality right here, right? Mom and dad's here, mom and dad's here, mom and dad's here. And then that traumatic event occurs, and now they have this whole other reality that they live in. And there's no negotiating back into the other reality. So trauma is that psychological and physical, I would argue, collision between what I expect in my life and now what my reality is. And what the treatment for that is, if you think about this long term, the treatment is how do you help someone that's experienced trauma to now find some way to exist in this new reality and continue to function. Because commonly what happens, and I hope no one's experienced this, but statistically speaking, someone probably has in this room, that what happens is that abrupt collision between your expected pattern and what your life is now causes you to be paralyzed for a period of time. And then you have to figure out how to come to a new understanding about how to exist in this new reality. And the challenge of this is, a friend of mine, she was talking to me one time, she's done a few talks with me, and she said, you know what, Jim, when you talk about trauma and that process of getting better, that process of understanding your new reality, she goes, one of the things too is there's some things that it keeps repeating itself, that you become almost re-traumatized. And she lost her father when she was in high school. And she said, and you know what happens is that, I lost him when I was 16 years old, but then when I got married, it was like I kind of lost him again. And when my son was born, and it was kind of like I lost him again. And there's these different points in my life where I seem to kind of lose him every time because I don't get to participate in the patterns that other people get to participate in. So that's an idea of what that trauma can look like and how you deviate and you create this new reality in a way. So when we start talking about how long we've been studying trauma in the United States specifically, what do you think the first group of people were we studied in the United States? Who do you think the first group was? Any guesses? It wasn't kids, I'll give you that. Veterans, yep. First place they started studying is when they first started calling it shell shock, right? Now, of course, they've changed the name since then to post-traumatic stress disorder. What they found was we had these guys that were going off to war. Typically, it was men at that point in time. They were going off to war and they seemed pretty okay when they left, and they came back. They had these similar symptoms and problems once they got back from war. And what they started to identify is there was something was happening with them psychologically and physically because of they lived in this reality here, and they went over to this other place and saw a whole abrupt shift in what their reality was, and then they were brought back into that original reality, and it was really hard for some folks for a lot of folks, I'm assuming, to now I've got to figure out how I'm going to exist in this new reality based upon these other patterns that I've experienced. And interestingly, back in the earlier parts of studying trauma, there used to be some folks that even said, it's actually better if you're traumatized as a child, because that way you got the rest of your life to get over it, which now we know is completely ridiculous, because we know early life trauma can affect a lot of your chemical and structural functioning of your brain if you're not careful. So here's a good question. How young can a kid experience trauma? How young you think, this is a trick question, so be careful. How young? I'm going to freak some of y'all out for just a second. In utero. Now, I have to be general in my definition of trauma. Here's the thing we know now that was kind of not the case back before, is we used to talk about, we didn't think that babies could have experiences in utero. And now we know that, right? Like, it wasn't too long ago, we just thought, well, when they're born, now they're having experiences. Or some people even believed, unless you have the memory of it, it's not like it's really an experience. Well, now we know that babies can respond to stimulus, especially in that third trimester. I remember Tricia, my wife, I have two boys. My boys are 10 and 6. And I remember when she was pregnant with Jake, which was our first one, and they were doing the ultrasound. Like now they have like 14D ultrasounds. So like you can tell like where your kid's going to go to college and everything. It's fantastic. And you post them on Facebook and everybody's like, oh, he looks just like such and such. And you're like, that's such crap. He looks like something smashed against a window. That's what he looks like. But it just gives everybody something to do. But anyways, so we're at the ultrasound place, and they're doing the jelly scan on my wife's belly. And then they said, the lady doing the scan says, oh, he's being stubborn, right? Because he wouldn't show his face. Like, oh, of course he is. Oh, he's clearly being defiant right now. So she takes this thing, and she puts it close to kind of where his head is, and she pushes this button, and it goes, like that. And my son goes, oh, crap. And they take his picture, right? And I said, don't ever do that again. And she goes, why? And I'm like, my son will never play basketball, ever now. Why? Because he's going to have some deep-seated anxiety about buzzers for the rest of his life. And he's going to be in like a youth basketball game. They're going to ring the buzzer, and he's going to fall to his knees and not understand why. But anyways, so we know they can have experiences. One of the things I've done back home is I've done what I call the no drama talk with young parents. What that no drama talk is once somebody gets pregnant, I tell them, listen, you share your experiences with your baby. They may not be born yet, but if you're spending a lot of time in stress and drama and all that kind of stuff, you share those experiences with your baby. And if you have too much of that drama, you have too much of that stress, what happens is it can affect the development of your baby's brain and body. Now that's a lot of pressure for a young parent, but it's a reality. It's the truth. That's an important part, that we understand that it just doesn't start when you can remember. That trauma based on a physical, I always tell people, even if the brain doesn't remember, the body doesn't forget. Even if the brain doesn't remember, the body doesn't forget. You can have physical experiences and not recognize remember that. All right, so we start talking about like the trust cycle. This is an element of attachment. What we talk about here is when a baby's born, their first patterns are how they're taken care of. Okay? So if I have a baby, there's a need. So let's say I'm hungry. So then I cry, and then someone feeds me, and then I experience some relief, and then I develop what I call a morsel of trust. So what happens is this happens thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and as those happen, my brain and my body start to think about what kind of environment do I live in? How safe a place is this? How predictable of a place is this? How consistent is a place that I live in? Now, one of the things that I want you to consider, especially what can interrupt these patterns. Well, one of the common things you'll hear about, for example, happens right here, both at this expression to response. Postpartum depression is really common to have an impact here because it affects the woman's deep limbic system and their ability to respond to that cry. Another thing that comes into this is alcohol and other drugs. Substance abuse is a huge issue. Why is substance abuse a huge issue with this? Because it hijacks the reward centers of the brain. It confuses the brain. Because what happens is, as people withdraw from certain substances, their brain sends them these messages like, if we don't get this stuff, we're going to die. If we don't get this stuff, we're going to die. Or if we don't get this stuff, we're going to die. So what happens is, they're in that state of, if I don't get my substance, I'm going to die. And then their baby cries, and they're driven to also take care of the baby. So they get put in this double bind about, my brain tells me I'm going to die if I don't get this stuff, but my baby needs me. So what happens is some people will be put in this, and sometimes people will choose the substance over the needs of their child. depending on the significance of the addiction and circumstances and situation. So we start looking at that, and then you have a baby who's in a world where it's like, hold up, I don't always get my needs met. Hold up, sometimes I cry and I cry and I cry and nothing happens. Or maybe when I'm at home with mom and dad and they're using, I cry and nothing happens, I cry and nothing happens, I cry and nothing happens. But when I go and stay at grandma's house, I cry and they take care of me, and I cry and they take care of me. Well, you know what that message is to my body? Is the world is very unpredictable and inconsistent. And you just don't talk a kid out of that with a book at circle time and puppets. That's their body that's responding to that level of uncertainty and how that works. And they develop these ideas, what we call internal working models, and what they expect. What I tell adults, especially when I start talking to people working with kids, is listen, you are judged. A kid sees you, and a kid judges you by what you most represent in their life. Let me give you an example of this. I was doing a foster care evaluation. I walk out into the waiting room when I was practicing community mental health. I walk out into the waiting room. A little 5-year-old child in foster care and his caseworker's out there. Little guy looks at me, starts bawling, crying, runs and hides underneath the table. I've never seen this kid before in my life. Caseworker looks at me and goes, "Do you know him?" I said, "I've never seen him before in my life." And he's bawling and crying. So so we eventually get him, the caseworker gets him, takes him back in my office. And he's sitting in her lap, and he's rocking and crying, and he points at me and he says, "You look like my daddy." So I did physically look like his father. I later saw his father. I look like his dad. So guess what? If the brain's a pattern-seeking device, and I walk out and he sees me, what's his brain telling him about to happen next? What's his brain going to tell him? I'm going to hurt him, right? Now, does it matter if I have a bunch of degrees or love kids? Does that matter at all? Does that matter in that moment? The only thing that matters is what his brain tells him is about to happen in that situation. And his behavior's telling me what his brain's saying. Now, here's what we got to watch. If we're not careful, your ego will get involved, right? Kid runs and cries, you'll be like, "Hold on. I'm a child whisperer. Kids don't run from me," right? And I go and try to get that kid out from underneath that table. What am I doing? I'm at least contributing to his trauma, at least. So what you have to do when a kid gives me something like that is you take a step back and say, then you assess the situation and say, "Oh goodness, something's going on here that I don't understand right now, that I need more information about." Now here's the fact that I think is such a challenge. There's no shortcuts when you have a kid like that. It took 14 sessions with that kid. 14 sessions with that kid before he said to his caseworker, "Mr. Jim and I are going to play. You can go wait outside." Because what I had to do was, when he first saw me, I was just like his father, okay? So that's expected pattern, which leads to getting hurt, okay? So his father, obviously, as you can figure out, beat him half to death, and that's how he ended up in foster care. So his pattern for a person like his father is this. So what I had to do is have little small experiences with him that slowly separated me from the expected pattern of his father, to a point to where he felt comfortable enough that I wouldn't hurt him, that he would allow me to be with him alone. So one of the things I encourage you to think about is, especially if you're a teacher, an educator working with kids in your classroom environment, is you got all these kids, when you set foot into the classroom, they're all judging you by your common denominator. And it might not be your fault. That's what people get hooked up on. "It's not my fault." Well, no, it's not your fault, but now it's your responsibility. So if you're in a classroom and a young man that you worked with has a stepfather in his home that's abusive, and he just doesn't like men, you're in that now. So your job at that point is to separate yourself. Now here's a trick that I think, I won't say trick. Here's something that happens sometimes with kids that I've worked with that have been traumatized and expect certain patterns. They'll try to get you to behave like they're used to. What I mean by that is, if they're used to men being loud and dominating, and they're used to conflict and violence, they'll do things to bait you into that, if you will allow them to do that. Or, for example, if they're not used to a strong, educated woman in their life, or not used to women in general, they'll try to demean you to see what you'll do with that. So you have to create experiences that separate you from what they expect in their life. And that changes at their own pace a lot of times. So let's talk about how this idea then now creates these brains that are a little different. Now, I know trauma is a very important topic, but also talk about chronic stress is important to talk about too. That maybe it's not to that degree that we would call it traumatic, but maybe it's just a continued stressful existence that a kid lives in. And what happens is in the brain, these deep limbic, if you haven't read much about, if you get a chance, there's a small almond-shaped structure in there called your amygdala, okay? It's deep inside the brain. It's down in here, okay? It's in this part in the deep limbic system, right? I like to give things more useful names. So the amygdala, in my opinion, I call it your old crap button. That's its job. Scan the environment, find things to say old crap about. I mean, that's what it does. So it's coding, trying to figure out what's going to happen. If you get startled or something jumps out, whatever it might be, then that old crap button triggers the fight or flight response in your brain and your body. This is what the old crap button's for, right? Right, y'all. What kind of bears y'all have around here? Black bears? Yeah, brown, big, tall, grit. Y'all, no, okay. Big black. You know what think about this? Who's taking this picture? Right? Run, Carl, run. This is great, you know? Anybody knows anything? He looks like Zach Brown from the Zach Brown Band, too. Anybody knows anything about bears knows that he is in a very difficult situation right now. This is what the fight or flight response is for. It's to trigger this physiological response to react to a crisis situation. That's what the stress response is for. Stress response is not bad. It's profoundly useful in this specific situation to do these different things. You got to get your blood pressure cranked up, right? Because you got to get blood to the big muscles. That's the job. You got to get that stuff moving. You have different things like your breathing becomes more shallow, all that kind of thing. Now, one of the things I want you to think about, though, is what if your daily life has a lot of this happening every day? What if a lot of conflict in the morning, or a lot of fighting during your day, or you're not sure where you're going to, if people are going to be home when you get home. Maybe mom or dad is incarcerated. Maybe you're going to go to school and there's a kid that's been messing with you every day for the last 3 weeks, and you got to go deal with that today. What if your whole day felt like this? Or at least a lot of your day felt like this. This wears the body out. Absolutely wears the body out. And also can affect things like, for example, your hippocampus and the way you integrate memory. That's one of the things that makes it hard for kids that experience trauma and stress, is a lot of times they look like all the other kids, but their brains don't code things the same. They can have trouble integrating and learning things. So it might mean that they don't have traditional learning disabilities, but their brains don't learn at the same pace or cadence in the same way because of that chronic stress. And I'll show you an example, a picture of this in just a second. Also, you'll see things like decreased immune functioning for people. Now, what that happens, anybody have a stressful week and then the next week you get sick? Anybody ever have that happen? Because what happens is your body only has 100% energy. So it has to commit that energy in a way that says, one part of my energy is about right here, right now. One part of my energy is about preparing for the future. Right here, probably 99.9% of his energy is worried about right here, right now. Because the future may not matter. When you're sleeping, a larger percentage of your brain and body is functioning on, I'm preparing for the future. So your body's constantly weighing that stuff back and forth. In this situation, he's not worried about his immune system. It may not matter, right? He's not worried about digestion. And he's not digesting his muffin from this morning. That's why something you'll watch is you'll have kids that get, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but you'll have kids that get sick a lot. You'll have kids that complain a lot about stomach issues and headaches. They might not be able to tell you, because for some of these kids, chronic stress is their warm water. It's what they're used to. Doesn't mean it's good for them, but it's what they're used to. Now, in a chronic stress environment, the primary goal is survival. I just got to survive. I got to make it through the day. That's my job. I want to make it through the day. I'm going to show you a quick scan here. This is from Bruce Perry's work. This just gives you an example of what it looks like. This little brain on the left is a little 3-year-old, comes from a typical developmental situation. Little brain on the right comes from a little 3-year-old who's been extremely neglected. Now here's the thing with that little brain on the right. Look at the pure difference in neural mass. That little girl was extremely isolated. Her mother had significant mental health challenges and kept her really isolated. Not a lot of affection, not a lot of love, not a lot of social exposure. Because isolation and neglect, the brain can't grow because it needs those experiences to grow. Also, the other side of that is if you have chronic stress in your life, your brain doesn't grow well because it's constantly just trying to survive the moment, so it doesn't have that ability to plan for the future. It doesn't use food well. It doesn't use digestion as well because it's so worried about, I've just got to survive this moment. Now, one of the things I deal a lot with in schools that I tell folks we got to start thinking about is that little girl, when she grows up, well, she's already grown up now, but the behavioral profile for a child whose neural mass is that small, she's probably going to be, her intellectual ability is going to be low, typically speaking. She's going to be very impulsive, potentially could have struggle. Well, we'll have global delays such as in fine motor, gross motor, all these kinds of things. Let me tell you what, she's going to be hard to handle. She's going to be hard to handle. Now, you tell me, and this is one of the things I'm dealing with a lot in schools, do you think timeout's going to fix that little brain? You think you sit over there and think about what you've done is going to work on that little brain? She needs OT, PT, anything with a T at the end of it, put her in it. I don't care what it is, put her in it, right? Because she needs stimulation. We know what isolation gets, and that's what timeout, detention, suspension, and expulsion is. That's isolation. We know that if you isolate that, we know what we get with that brain because that's what we got. So if we're looking at kids that have significant trauma, significant stress, and we think that our primary response for that is isolation, then we're going to get more of what we got already, because that doesn't grow brains. Isolation doesn't grow brains. Rehabilitation and connection grows brains. That's a whole other talk, but I got it a different day. Loss of a caregiver. These are some of the things you'll see. Now let me ask you about this. Divorce is somewhat of a common thing now, right? I mean, 50%, give or take. I remember we were teenagers, so you got to give us a little bit of cushion. There was a bunch of us playing basketball one time, and like 7 of the 10 guys' parents were divorced, and we were making fun of the kids whose parents were still together. We're like, look at you, weirdo, parents living together. You only have one Christmas. Look at you, right? Now, only if you come from a divorced family can you laugh at that, right? But it's not like it's terribly uncommon and somewhat socially acceptable. Now, but is it traumatic for a child? Even if it's socially acceptable, is it traumatic for a child? Yes. Why? Anybody don't know why? The pattern change. Exactly. It's that pattern shift that happens. I expect that my parents are going to be together. I expect that my parents have been together, my parents have been together. Now I have this whole new reality of separation. Now I've got to figure out how to exist within. Now, can that happen? Absolutely. Absolutely that can happen. I've run into people who are much better mothers and fathers when they're not husbands and wives. Now, I'm not trying to endorse divorce, but what I am saying is there are circumstances where that is the case. So what you start looking at is that is traumatic for a kid. Now, another thing I'd talk about is, let me say this, and this was a question asked me when I was in Cleveland one time. And they said, what about the kid that every morning when he goes to get to the bus, he has to step over or around someone, a drug addict or someone that's right there. They've saw it their whole life and they go out there. Is that trauma? What do you think? Is that trauma? Does it deviate from their expected pattern? I'm not going to tell you that's good for a kid, but what I am going to say is every morning that kid doesn't go out there and go, oh, he's not startled by it. Why? It's just part of his day-to-day functioning. Again, I'm not saying it's good for a kid, but I'm also not saying it's a traumatic shock to their psychological system. So I think sometimes what we think about, like for example, if you go to a home visit or something that might seem shocking to you, a kid may be very used to. For example, maybe I live in a circumstance where there's 8, 9 people living in my house, and it's not uncommon for creatures to run around and things like that. Well, you might be sitting in their living room and go, oh my gosh, is that not terrible? And the kid goes, well, you just got to know. You just got to be aware of how that works, because that's not an extreme deviation from their thing. So what happens is we have these kids, and because of the trauma, they start to identify they have this whole new world they're living in. And what I find interesting about this is this thing here I'll show you. Is some of our kids develop this ability to have split personalities. What does that mean? In order to survive at my house, I have to have this personality. And then when I come in here to any of my schools, I have to create this whole other personality to be successful. Because we know that if some of your kids took the personality they have here at school back home, they wouldn't make it. But when they come here, and that's one of the things I think is always so interesting, we talk about pattern recognition. If I'm a little guy, and from when I was 4 years old to when I was born to when I was 4 or 5 years old, in my house, if you wanted a toy, you ask once and you throat punch second, right? Like, I want that toy. I'm going to ask you one more time, right? And then I come to kindergarten, and I want that toy, and you don't give it to me, guess what I'm going to do? We're going to go Jean-Claude Van Damme on somebody right now, right? And we go, oh my gosh. That's a maladaptive behavior. Come, let's read a story, right? And we expect like the kid to go, oh, why didn't you say something earlier? I didn't realize this is no throat punch zone, right? It's hard. Now this kid has to recognize is when I live in this environment, I have these rules. When I live in this environment, I have these rules. And I've even watched kids. It's amazing how well they can adapt. I've seen kids that when their parents show up or whoever their caregiver is, I can watch their behavioral change happen right then. Has anybody ever seen that? Or you see them in the store with their family and you think, who's this kid? Because they've adjusted their personality to survive. And I think sometimes appreciating that in a kid, that resiliency in a kid, will make you respect the kid that much more. Is, man, I don't know, I know as an adult that would be hard to pull off. To be able to have to adjust your personality in that specific way. So what can we do to be helpful? What can you do? First thing is we check ourselves. We understand that it's not about you. That if a kid just meets you in your class and it seems like they already don't like you, it couldn't possibly be because of you because they don't even know you yet. So we have to start thinking about, hey, because the challenge with a lot of folks is they take this stuff so personally early and they think it's like he gets up every morning to ruin my day. Yes, of course. At 7, he puts his feet on the floor and goes, another day to ruin the adults in my school's life, right? It's because we are very selfish in our thought process. Kid, we're just the next person on the tracks for some of these kids. And I think understanding that. The big thing I tell people is pack your bags. We all have our own baggage, right? Some people is packed better than others. Everybody's got baggage. Everybody's got skeletons. Sometimes you got to check some of that stuff for yourself. I talk more about that stuff when I talk about 10 things, because 10 things talks a lot about the idea of our own filters and our own experiences and how we were raised and how those things impact the way that we view the world and the way that we interact with kids in that specific way. I tell people no theory. I know it sounds like a super nerdy thing to say, but I have a professor in my master's program that said, people that say theory doesn't matter don't know theory. Understanding how development should happen, generally speaking, should occur, helps you be more thoughtful when it deviates. It helps you understand what kind of experiences kids need at different points in their life. So if you understand, like, trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, then you start to see where some kids may have never developed that trust so early in their life that's where you start with them. That's where they'll start with, because they don't have that trust element as a part of their psychology. I tell people, especially when you start talking to kids and you think there's specifically something traumatic that's happened, is do no harm. First, do no harm, especially if you're talking to a kid, if you think a kid that's experiencing trauma. I tell folks, don't ask questions that you're not ready for answers. Too often folks get curious and they'll ask questions and then they get certain answers or certain responses, but they're not certain how to deal with that. There's no shame in that. Bring other folks in to support you in that, or develop your knowledge and understanding about how to best interact with the child who's had specific experiences, and make sure you're doing that. Be careful about assigning meeting. That's a pretty common thing. I had a case one time where a little girl had disclosed a sexual abuse from her uncle. And the person doing the interview said, oh, we'll make sure that he stops doing those dirty and awful things to you. Now, why is that a problem? When you say the words dirty and awful, what's the problem with that? Now, she was a part of those dirty and awful things, and if you're not careful, she'll assign that value on herself. So we got to be super, super careful that although that sounds like the thing you should say in some instances, you have to be extremely careful, because what you can do is create doubt or those seeds of those ideas in there. And I always talk about just don't push, because you'll cause kids to lock up even more and things like that. One thing I tell folks, my biggest behavioral hack for working with kids, when you have the stress response, imagine that guy with the bear. When he saw that bear, right? He has all this energy. The way the stress response works is it floods your body with the adrenaline, which is kind of like, I don't know that much about cars, but I have watched all the Fast and Furious movies, so I have a baseline understanding of how cars work, I guess, right? So you know how they have the NOS that they push that gets in the engine, and here's the thing I can deduct from general science and understanding, that obviously nitrous oxide burns hotter, so it makes the engine run faster. But if you burn it too long, you melt the block, right? That's just my Fast and Furious definition. I'm sure somebody's like, dude, you're way off. But it'll work for what I'm about to talk about. So anyways, so what the stress response is basically like pushing a NOS button. And your body's built for those bursts, but then it needs to burn all that adrenaline, or NOS needs to burn all that adrenaline in order to get away or do what it is. Now the problem with that is if I'm a kid who the button gets pushed over and over and over and over and over again, then I can create all this residual energy. So people start talking about, one of the biggest mistakes people make is they start with the psychology. They start with the mental stuff. You know what you start? Physiology. You know what you do with the kids got a lot of stress hormone left in their body? Let them move. Move them around. Let them jump, wiggle, dance, whatever it is. You got to figure out ways to dissipate some of that physical energy. And what's amazing to me is sometimes we have these kids, and this is a kid on the wall at recess doing this for 45 minutes, right? And then we bring him in after recess after he's been on the wall, and we're mad because he won't sit and read our book with us or do his math. This is a kid that needs to dissipate that physical energy. And if you don't know about sensory integration issues, you need to learn about sensory strategies. Because sensory strategies are a great way, even with big kids, people, high school folks want to be like, we don't. Even with bigger kids, there's things you can do that'll help sync their brain and body up that gets rid of some of that energy. Because when we talk about thermodynamics, energy does not change, energy doesn't go away, it only changes forms. Now you can decide what you do with that energy that kid has left over, or you can let that kid decide what they're going to do with that energy. And I promise you'd rather be in charge of what that would look like. All right. Start talking about how do we provide this health? How do we provide this physiological balance? What is emotional health? What do we want for kids? We want kids to have a generally stable psychology, which means their mood, if we on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I'm super depressed, 10 being I'm the happiest person on earth, I want kids to hang around that 4 to 6 range. Just kind of hang around that 4 to 6 range. If they have something really happy happen, I want them to go up. If they have something really sad happen, it's okay if it goes down. But we want them to get back into that kind of normal level of functioning, right? That's our goal. How do we create that? Now, physical health is created by a certain diet that has a certain amount of intake that creates a certain amount of physiological state. This is what I've created that talks about what kids need emotionally to create a balanced psychology, which plays off the whole my plate idea. If you notice, love and belonging has its own category. It is not part of the pie. It is its own thing. It's what exists and doesn't share. So love and belonging is the undertone of everything. And if we look at these other things, the biggest thing kids need is stability. Biggest thing I need. Biggest helping is I need stability. The other ones that are in second are broke into thirds. I need challenge and responsibility, I need success, and I need consequence and failure. And the smallest thing I need in my life is loss. Now real quick, I'm going to hit each one of these fast. I've already told you about that one. I go into schools, have big fancy mission statements like we're creating global learners for a better tomorrow and rainbow riding and this kind of stuff, right? Let me tell you what, you want to have the 2 best things you want kids to learn well in your building? Do 2 things first. Make them feel safe and that they matter. That's you want to get the human in a state where they'll achieve their highest potential. Make them feel safe. How do I feel safe? My environment's consistent, predictable, and loving. What I feel like if I matter, I add value to the environment, which means if I'm not here, my value's missing. So people care if I'm not here because my value's not there. So if I want to talk about in your building, and then we can stack all the curriculum on top of that, but you got to be a place where, and I need to be able to ask kids that. I should be able to pull kids and say, is this a safe place? Not just in like school safety, but is this a predictable place? Is this a consistent place? Do people care about you here? Yes. Do you have value here? Do you have significance here? Who cares if you're not here? What happens if you're not here? Who checks up on you if you're absent too long? What things do you do in this school that this school would miss if you weren't here? Those are the 2 most important things that you can find. Then after that, then we can go get merit scholarships and those kinds of things. All right. We talked to folks about, I know I'm going really fast, but it'll be okay, I promise. Kids need safety, and one of the things that keeps safety is adults need to be in charge. There's some people go, what do you mean by adults need to be in charge. Adults need to be confident and calm and assertive. They need adults that are comfortable enough in their own skin to lead them. Because kids know they're not supposed to lead at this stage in their life. They need adults that can lead them, that are stable and consistent enough to lead them. They don't need jellyfish. A jellyfish is somebody that doesn't have a spine, right? They don't need a jellyfish. but they also don't need a dominator either. What they need is someone who's comfortable enough in their own skin. They need leadership, which helps with that stability. So what's the stability look like? Schedule. Is it my schedule's predictable? Discipline's predictable. So if I use profanity on Tuesday, my consequence should be the same as I use profanity on Thursday. Why? Because my adults are organized in how they're going to deal with our problems that we have. And the affection is predictable. What's predictable affection mean? It means affection isn't based upon your performance. It's just based upon, I'm going to greet every kid getting off the bus. Or when I meet a family in a therapeutic relationship, this is the way I'm going to greet them every time. That's a predictable and consistent place. We want to challenge, this is the last two things I'll say and then I got to go, but important part we start talking about is too often with kids that have experienced trauma and have stress, we think of them as these delicate little flowers that we shouldn't challenge them, we shouldn't push them. But one of the best ways to help a person who's experienced trauma, because what trauma does to you is it takes some of your certainty away, which then takes what you feel as power to influence your environment. So one of the ways you can help them heal is to challenge them. Challenge them in their area of ability. Help them develop a sense of mastery. Help them develop the ability and the control over their outcomes now. Give them things. That's where I've worked with kids that, for example, where you see like where athletics or academics for a kid who's come from a tough background, they start having some success. And what that does is it gives them that sense of maybe I'm not a victim of my environment anymore. Maybe I do have control over my outcomes. That's a huge shift in the mind of somebody with psychology. So step one you're going to do, stop old patterns. If a kid's in threat or harm, of course we stop those old patterns. Second part is we're going to build relationships with kids. How do we build relationships with them? We make sure they feel safe with us, and we make sure they feel like they matter. Not just safety and significance. I build that relationship that creates that context. The next part is I build new patterns. This may have been what you've expected from the adults in your life. This is what you can expect from me. There's nothing more gratifying in working with young people than to watch them adjust their pattern about you. That they started one way, they didn't trust you, they didn't think you cared about them, they didn't want to learn from you, and then slowly watch them because you're predictable, consistent, you make them feel safe and they matter, and watch them develop. Because you are somebody, you have a relationship, and you have new patterns that they have faith in, and they're willing to let go of that couch to move toward you. They're willing to they'll leave that safety of what they've known to take that risk to grow, develop, change, and improve because of what environment you've created for them. So I can't possibly summarize everything about trauma. My whole goal for you is to help you think about this in a functional way. Think about, it doesn't matter what your role is, you can help kids that experience trauma and extreme neglect or extreme stress. Even if you're someone who's just greeting kids in the hallway and saying hi and making eye contact, whatever it might be, everyone has the ability to create an environment where these kids can get better. Okay? All right. Thanks for your time, gang. Appreciate it.